Want a simple world? Follow the simple world.
For the Caribbean countries, Cuba is perhaps the most famous one. Whenever the word Cuba is mentioned, what comes to our mind is probably still the surname Castro. The Castro brothers have completely faded out of Cuba politics, and the top leader in Cuba now is called Canel, whose full name is Diaz-Canel. He assumed office in April 2018 and became the president of Cuba's Council of State. After the Labor Day break, President Canel becomes a little irritable because President Trump and his gang started giving Cuba trouble again. The trouble is quite special this time, as Trump announced the ban lifting on a special clause in a bill, which allows the U.S. citizens to sue certain Cuba state-linked individual or enterprise. Compensation will have to be paid if they win, and the U.S. government will impose sanctions on the defendant accordingly. Back to the days after the Castro brothers successfully led the Cuban Revolution, for many reasons, they changed the Cuban regime from capitalism to socialism. The fundamental difference between these two systems is whether the means of production are private-owned or public-owned. In order to live up to the socialist regime, the Castro brothers nationalized the properties of some big capitalists and either redistributed it to the poor or invited foreign investment in the country's name. Those unlucky capitalists fly to the nearby U.S. cities where they settle down and give birth to their children. For many years, they have been holding the flag of anti-Cuba high and never forgot about their properties lost there. A socialist country came out on its doorstep, also in a good relationship with the Soviet Union, which is absolutely not within the range of tolerance for the United States. So, by economic blockade, they plan to suffocate this weird regime. And also exactly from that time when Cuba slowly raised its anti-American flag. Later on, at the height of the Cold War between the US and the USSR, Cuba even played a game of Cuba Missile Crisis hand in hand with the USSR, which completely let the Americans down, and the intensity of the economic blockade against Cuba was doubled for over half a century. In 1996, the US government passed a bill with the name of the Helms-Burton Act. The content of this bill can be summarized in 3 titles. Title 1 is to continue to strengthen international sanctions against Cuba, and Title 2 is to support Cubans to establish a free and independent country. And Title 3 states that if the properties confiscated by the Castro brothers are operated or invested by some foreigners, the United States courts would accept charges against them. And once the defendant loses, their passports will never be stamped by the customs of the United States. So who will be the defendants under Title 3 of the Burton Act? Actually, they will be those foreigners who went to Cuba to invest and do business. Superficially, Title 3 seems to be for the sake of justice, but its real purpose is to completely cut off Cuba's foreign trade and foreign investment, to make it completely impossible to live on, to force the Cubans to overthrow the Castro brothers. In this way, Cuba would turn from an anti-American country to a pro-American one. For the 20 years after the Helms-Burton Act was born, Title 3 of the Act has never been implemented and has been in a suspended status. The reason for the suspension was that it was not suitable for implementation. There are very few Americans who invested in Cuba, and most of the investors there are Europeans and Canadians. They own tobacco factories, sugar mills, travel agencies, and mines in Cuba. If Title 3 was implemented, the Europeans would have been sued. To avoid damaging the relationship with the European allies, all the former U.S. presidents reached an agreement on suspending Title 3 of the Act, which almost formed a tradition. But President Trump is someone who is not afraid of breaking with traditions, and there have been plenty of cases. He is the one who closed the border, who built the border wall, who skipped the White House Correspondents' Dinner, who refused to release his tax return, and now the one who enforces the Helms-Burton Act Title 3 and encourages people to go to courts. As soon as news was released, some Cuban Americans couldn't wait to make some moves. No wonder President Canel is bothered so much. The United States has sanctioned Cuba for more than 50 years. Although every year someone would call on the United States to stop the sanction in the United Nations General Assembly, arguing that the USSR is gone, so is Castro, and it doesn't make any sense to continue the embargo. But the Americans are not persuaded and seemingly plan to carry on with the sanctions forever. 2016 was the last year of Obama's term. In that year, the peace-loving Obama visited Cuba with his family, and then the trade between the U.S. and Cuba became more flourishing. When everyone thought Cuba would move forward to a new era, Trump was elected. How time flies! Trump has served his term for 3 years and 4 months. The first 2 years of it, his diplomatic focuses were mainly on the Middle East areas. To be specific, he stared at Syria and Israel for most of the time, imposed sanctions on Russia for Syria and sanctions on Iran for Israel. But no matter for Syria or Israel, the EU was all dragged into. If a place captivates Russia and US, even the EU, it marks the focus of international situation. When Trump's presidency came to its 3rd year, we can tell that he got another focus, which is Latin America, more specifically Venezuela. In fact, in the first 2 years, Venezuela brought Trump some trouble, yet comparing with Syria, it means little. Now the situation in Syria is prone to be stabilized. There is no more existence for the US over there. Therefore, Venezuela, which suffers from the drop in oil price and inflation, becomes the top target. The Uncle Sam never expected Russia's allies staying in its doorsteps. However, both of Venezuela and Cuba maintain good relationships with Russia, even implant a wholly different system from America. So there is no way for the US to tolerate it. At the end of January this year, Juan Guaido, the president of Venezuela's parliament, called himself as interim president at a rally. No one knows where his idea came from. At the moment, when Trump's administration heard of this news, they realized it's time to do something. The United States spares no effort to support Guaido, not only recognizing him as Venezuela's president on many international occasions, but also airdropping supplies for him in a big way. And even more than once, all choices are on the table. But Guaido's strange behavior also gave Russia a chance to give timely help to Venezuela, so Putin stands firmly on Maduro's side. Over the past few months, Russians have been doing everything they could do, for instance, verbal comfort, material assistance, or even military communications. So 3 months have passed since Guaido declared himself interim president, but there is still no big news, which made Trump really upset. Trump has a reputation for efficiency. He can't stand the way of putting things off, and those who refuse to carry out his plan, or those who got in the way of what he's doing, he will fire them all. This is a habit he picked up when doing his real estate business. In the past 2 years, this habit has been manifested many times. Now things are not going well in Venezuela. It seems that Maduro and Putin have got their upper hand after a few months, which makes Trump angry and anxious. If this could be resolved by firing staff, perhaps several more ministers in the White House have been sacked already. So will the Americans fall into the same trap in Venezuela like what they did in Syria? We can jump to a conclusion that the US lost all his battles in Syria. The most critical time for the situation of Syria is 2016. At that time, Obama had only 1 year left in office. He was just rewarded Nobel Peace Prize and didn't want to get involved in a war before leaving, therefore behaved hesitant and weak in Syria. When Trump inaugurated in 2016, Syria had already been under control of Russia. The rebels' courts who had been invested by the US were all in bankruptcy in liquidation. However, for the failure in Syria, Trump could count on Obama. But if the same thing happened again in Venezuela, it would be hard to find a scapegoat. Thinking about this, Trump is anxious and angry. He brought his staff together to discuss countermeasures. They soon discovered a pattern. Behind all the countries they want to sanction, it is always Russia. Who appeared in the battlefield of Syria is Russia. Who appeared when US blocked Iranian oil is Russia. It's still Russia when the US riots Venezuela. Since Russia is a meddler, then give it something more to do, to see how many businesses it can deal with on Earth. When the discussion finished, Cuba was on the blacklist. During the 3 months that Trump endured Guajardo, Cuba's performance was impressive. Taking advantage of its geographic location, it provided information to Maduro. Whenever the Americans want to do something, Cuba always stepped out first, expressing support for Maduro, and disdaining the American but lavishing praises on Russia. Its sense of presence reached so high that it seems for fearing Russia would forget about it. Now that Cuba has been blacklisted, then Cuba should experience the consequences that nosiness would entail, which moreover can cause trouble to nosy all-the-time Russia. The Title III of the Helms-Burton Act is dug out under these circumstances. For Trump at this moment, it is exactly what he desires, so he gives order to carry it out directly, regardless of his advisor's opinion. Once this news is in the air, the Cuban government strongly opposed it as expected, and Canal was in a frowning face. Trump smiled in satisfaction at this sight, and this happened with no surprises. But when Canada and European countries stand out and oppose this act, things are getting troublesome. As we said before, if the US, Russia, and the EU starts to quarrel over an issue in the same region, then this region will become the focus of the world affairs. Now it looks like the Caribbean Sea has become the second focus after the Persian Gulf. When the US took the lead to bully Venezuela in support of Guaido, the EU countries followed to agree one after another, since doing so is on the side of freedom of democracy as they have been claiming. When the US began to bully Cuba, the EU countries followed to disagree one after another by condemning the US violating the international laws. In the eyes of these powerful hunters, the international laws seem to be just an excuse which can be perfectly used to cover up their values of benefits outweighs justice. Thanks for watching. Share if you like us. See you next time.